My name is Martha Patterson. I'm 70 years old, and on my milestone birthday, my entire family abandoned me for a secret cruise. Before I tell you all about how a simple DNA test led to the unraveling of a master manipulator and the return of my family, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. The scent of rosemary and thyme from the roasting beef should have been a fragrance of celebration. For 3 weeks, it was all I could think about. A 70th birthday. It felt significant, a proper milestone that deserved more than a simple card. It deserved family. It deserved the warm, boisterous chaos of the people I loved most in the world gathered around my dining table. I ran a hand over the starched white tablecloth, its crispness a small satisfaction. The silver, my mother's silver, gleamed under the soft light of the chandelier. I'd polished every piece this morning until my reflection stared back at me, a woman with more laugh lines than she'd ever expected, and hair the color of snow. 7 place settings. My son, Richard, and his wife, Victoria. My grandchildren, 7-year-old James and 5-year-old Lily, my sister Ruth and her husband Carl, and me at the head of the table. For each one, I had written their name on a small cream-colored card in my best cursive. At 6 o'clock, the roast was resting, the potatoes were golden, and the chocolate fudge cake, Richard's favorite since he was a boy, sat on the kitchen counter, a monument of dark, glossy perfection. I smoothed the front of my new navy blue dress for the 10th time and took a final look around. It was perfect. All that was missing were the people. I'd even called my best friend and neighbor, Eleanor, earlier in the day. "Are you sure this isn't too much, Elle? Maybe we should have just gone out." I could hear the smile in her voice over the phone. "Martha Patterson, you stop that right now. You've spent your life taking care of everyone else. You deserve to be celebrated. They'd be fools not to come." Fools, I thought, as the grandfather clock in the hall chimed 6:30, the designated arrival time. I stood by the window, peering through the lace curtains at the empty driveway. No headlights turned onto our quiet suburban street. Maybe they were running late. Richard's job as an architect often kept him later than planned, and wrangling 2 small children was never easy. I understood. I raised him after all. I knew all about the last-minute spills and the lost shoes that could derail an entire evening. By 7, a knot of anxiety had formed in my stomach. The roast was getting cold. I called Richard's cell. It went straight to voicemail. "Hi, you've reached Richard. Please leave a message." I hung up without speaking. I tried Victoria. Same result. Then I called my sister, Ruth. Voicemail again. A chill that had nothing to do with the autumn evening crept over me. This was strange. Not a single text message, not a call. I walked back into the dining room. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was oppressive. It mocked the festive decorations and the carefully set table. The empty chairs seemed to accuse me of some foolish, hopeful delusion. Had I gotten the date wrong? No. I'd checked the calendar a dozen times. I'd sent out a group text 2 weeks ago, and Victoria had replied with a string of celebratory emojis. The clock struck 8. The house was dark, except for the lonely glow of the dining room. The party was over before it had even begun. I felt a familiar, heavy ache settle in my chest, the ache of being an afterthought. It was an ache I had been trying to ignore for years. Defeated, I began the solitary task of clearing the untouched feast. I wrapped the perfect slices of beef in foil, my movements mechanical. I scraped the golden potatoes into a container, their warmth a sad reminder of the meal that never was. Each clink of cutlery against porcelain echoed in the vast emptiness of the house. As I stood by the sink, ready to wash the first plate, my phone buzzed on the counter. A notification from Facebook. My heart gave a stupid little leap of hope. Maybe it was an apology, an explanation. I dried my hands and picked up the phone. The notification was for a new post from Victoria Patterson. I tapped it open, and the world tilted on its axis. It wasn't a picture of a flat tire or a sick child. It was a photo album. The cover image was of my entire family: Richard, Victoria, James, Lily, Ruth, and Carl, grinning, their faces tanned and joyful, posing on the deck of a massive cruise ship. The deep blue of the Mediterranean Sea stretched out behind them. Victoria's arm was slung around my son's shoulders, and she was holding a brightly colored cocktail. The caption, posted just an hour ago, read, "Living our best life. So grateful for this amazing family getaway. Hashtag surprise trip. Hashtag family first." I clicked through the photos, my thumb moving as if it belonged to someone else. There they were, eating at a fancy restaurant on the ship. There they were, waving from a balcony with the coast of Italy in the background. There was Lily, my sweet, shy Lily, building a sandcastle on a beach I'd never see. My sister Ruth was laughing, her head thrown back, a wide-brimmed hat perched on her head. They were all there, everyone I had cooked for, everyone I had waited for. They hadn't forgotten, they had replaced me. The screen blurred. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It wasn't just the exclusion, it was the deceit, the silence. The smiling faces in the pictures felt like a personal, calculated cruelty. And then, as if on cue, another buzz, a text message from Richard. "Sorry, Mom, forgot to mention we'd be out of town this week. Victoria booked a surprise trip. Happy birthday, though." Forgot to mention. The casual indifference of those 3 words was more painful than a deliberate insult. It was a confirmation of my irrelevance. I wasn't important enough to remember, not even on my 70th birthday? I set the phone down. I looked at the untouched chocolate cake on the counter. Then I looked back at the smiling faces on the screen. And that's when something inside me shifted. The deep, aching sadness that had been my companion for so long began to burn away, replaced by something else, something cold and hard and clear. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I took a deep breath, picked up my phone, and took a screenshot of Victoria's post and Richard's text message. Then, with a steady hand, I called Eleanor. Her voice was full of concern. "Martha, is everything okay? I was just thinking about you." My own voice, when it came out, was devoid of any tremor. It was the voice of a woman who had just seen the truth in the starkest light imaginable. "Eleanor," I said, "can you come over? And please bring wine." I didn't know it then, but that night wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of a war I never wanted to fight, but one I was suddenly determined to win. Eleanor arrived in less than 10 minutes. Her face was a mask of worry. She carried a bottle of Pinot Noir like a medic carrying a first aid kit. She took one look at my face, then at the still perfect dining room, and her expression hardened with a knowing anger on my behalf.
"Oh, honey," she said, wrapping her arms around me. "They didn't." I didn't have to say a word. I just nodded and led her to the kitchen, where my phone lay on the counter, still glowing with the images of my family's sun-drenched betrayal. I slid it across the granite towards her. Eleanor put on her reading glasses, her brow furrowed. She scrolled through the pictures, her lips getting thinner with each swipe. She read the caption, then the text message from Richard. When she finally looked up, her blue eyes were spitting fire. "That woman," she said, her voice low and tight, "that is not a surprise trip. That is a declaration of war, Martha. How dare she? And on your birthday?" She poured 2 generous glasses of wine, her movements sharp and angry. We sat at the small kitchen table, the grand, empty dining room a looming presence next to us. "This isn't the first time, is it?" Eleanor asked gently, though it wasn't really a question. I shook my head, swirling the deep red liquid in my glass. The humiliation was a bitter taste in my mouth. "No," I admitted, the word barely a whisper. "It's just the loudest." As we sat there, the memories I had so carefully packed away began to spill out, like letters from a box whose bottom has just given way. Remember James's 5th birthday, I said, my gaze distant. The bouncy castle party. I spent a week knitting him a sweater, his favorite color blue. When I got there, Victoria met me at the door. She had this pained look on her face, said James had woken up with a terrible fever and they had to cancel everything. She seemed so apologetic, so I just handed her the gift and went home feeling sorry for them. Eleanor nodded slowly. I remember. You were so disappointed. That evening, I continued, my voice flat, I saw a post from another mom in the neighborhood. A picture of a dozen kids, including James, laughing their heads off inside that bouncy castle. When I asked Victoria about it later, she just laughed it off. Oh, Martha, you worry too much. His fever broke right after you left. It was a miracle. We didn't want to bother you again. Eleanor refilled my glass. Bother you, she repeated, the words dripping with sarcasm. Then there was Lily's first day of kindergarten, I went on, the dam of my restraint finally breaking. She told me it started at 9. I got there at 8:45 with a special first-day cookie I'd baked for her. The school was empty. The principal told me the kids had all gone in at 8. I missed it. I missed seeing her walk in with her little backpack. Victoria's excuse? Oh my goodness, did I say 9? My brain is just mush these days. She even squeezed my arm as if we were sharing a silly secret. The slights, which had seemed like thoughtless oversights at the time, now lined up like soldiers in a row, each one a strategic move in a long campaign. The Christmas dinner, I was told, would be a small, quiet affair, just the 4 of them, only to later find out from Ruth that they'd hosted 20 people. The Mother's Day brunch I was uninvited from because Lily was going through a clingy phase and only wanted mommy. Every excuse, every sweet-sounding lie was a brick in the wall she had been building between me and my son. She's isolating you, Eleanor said, her voice firm. And she's isolating Richard. Think about it. When was the last time you saw him without her? When was the last time he called you, just to chat, without her voice in the background prompting him? I thought back, and a cold dread washed over me. It had been years. Richard, my thoughtful, loving son, had become a mouthpiece for his wife's agenda. His own memories of our life together, our traditions, seemed to have been overwritten by hers. Had he really forgotten the chocolate fudge cake, or had he been taught to forget? He's a good man, I said, a weak defense for my own child. He's just busy. He trusts her. He's a blind man, Eleanor corrected, her tone softening. And she's the one holding the blindfold, Martha. That woman is a professional. This isn't just garden variety daughter-in-law drama. The level of planning to get your entire family, including your own sister, to lie to you and abandon you on your 70th birthday? That is something else entirely. That is sociopathic. The word hung in the air between us. Sociopathic. It was a clinical, terrifying word, but it fit the cold, calculated nature of the act. What do I do, Elle? I asked, my voice finally breaking. The anger was still there, but beneath it was a vast, cavernous grief. He's my son. They're my grandchildren. You fight. You don't fight with her. You can't win a screaming match with a snake. You fight smarter. You fight for Richard's soul. You fight for your grandchildren's future. You fight for yourself, for the woman who deserves to be at the head of her own family's table. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Her grip was firm, grounding. For years, you've kept the peace. You've swallowed the insults. You've accepted the excuses. Look where it's gotten you. Alone in your own house on your birthday? The peace was never real. It was just quiet submission. Her words hit me with the force of a physical blow because they were true. My desire for harmony had been weaponized against me. My willingness to forgive had been seen as a license to transgress. I looked at the screenshot on my phone again. Living our best life. The phrase was a taunt. While I was sitting in my silent house, my heart breaking, they were living their best life without me. A new resolve settled into my bones. Eleanor was right. The quiet war of attrition was over. It was time for a different kind of war. I didn't know the rules of engagement yet, and I didn't have a plan. But as I stared at Victoria's smiling, triumphant face, I made a silent promise to myself. She may have won this battle, but I would not let her win the war. I straightened my back. More wine? I asked Eleanor, and for the first time that night, a real, albeit grim, smile touched my lips. We have a lot to plan. The week that followed was the longest of my life. The house remained silent. The cruise ship continued its journey through paradise, and I imagine my family did too, oblivious to the storm gathering back home. I didn't call them. I didn't text. My silence, I decided, would be my first weapon. Let them wonder. Let them, for once, be the ones to feel a flicker of uncertainty. Sleep offered little escape. I'd wake up in the dead of night, the images from Facebook burning behind my eyelids, but it wasn't just anger that kept me up anymore. It was purpose. Eleanor's words echoed in my head. Fight smarter. So I began to think. A retired English teacher isn't exactly a private investigator, but I'd spent 40 years teaching students how to analyze texts, to look for subtext, to find the truth hidden between the lines. I decided to apply that same scrutiny to Victoria.
On the third day, fueled by coffee and a grim determination, I started in the attic. It was a dusty archive of our family's life. Boxes of Richard's old school projects, photo albums, holiday decorations. I was looking for anything, any small inconsistency that might predate her complete control over our lives. I found a box labeled Richard and Victoria, 2014, the year they got married. Inside were wedding cards, menus, and a few stray items from their first apartment together. It all seemed normal, but at the very bottom, tucked inside a folded newspaper, was a stack of old mail that must have been gathered by mistake during their move. Bills, junk mail, and a few magazines. Most were addressed to Richard. But one, a credit card statement from a department store I didn't recognize, was addressed to a Catherine Winters at their old apartment address. Catherine Winters. The name meant nothing to me. I almost dismissed it as junk mail for a previous tenant. But something made me pause. A flicker of a memory. A long-ago conversation, right after they were engaged. I had asked Victoria about her family. She'd been vague, saying she wasn't close to them, that her parents had passed away years ago. She'd said her full name was Victoria Ann Miller. No mention of Catherine, no mention of Winters. My heart began to beat a little faster. It was probably nothing, a coincidence. But in my new reality, I no longer believed in coincidences. I carefully folded the statement and put it in my purse. It was a thread. Flimsy, perhaps, but it was a thread to pull. That afternoon, I met Eleanor for lunch. I told her what I'd found. Catherine Winters, she mused, tapping her chin. It could be anything, Martha. A former roommate, a mistake. I know, I said, but my gut is telling me otherwise. Every story she's ever told me has been polished, too perfect. A beautiful, tragic orphan who found love with my son. It sounds like something out of a novel, not real life. Eleanor took a sip of her iced tea, her eyes sharp. So what are you going to do with a name and an old bill? This was the moment, the point of no return. I took a deep breath. I'm going to hire someone else. Someone who can pull on this thread and see what unravels. Her eyebrows shot up. A private investigator? Martha, are you sure? That costs a fortune. That's money for your retirement, for your future. What future? I countered, my voice low but firm. A future where I'm shut out of my own family? A future where my grandchildren are raised by a woman I don't know and can't trust? That's not a future. It's a prison sentence. I have a healthy retirement fund. My husband, God rest his soul, was a careful man. He left me a small inheritance that I have barely touched. He would want me to use it to protect our son. Eleanor knew my late husband, Robert. She knew he would have despised what was happening. She saw the iron resolve in my eyes. I know a guy, she said after a long moment. My nephew used him for a messy divorce case last year. The man is discreet, thorough, and looks more like an accountant than a detective. His name is Frank Miller.
The irony of the last name was not lost on us. The next day, I was sitting in a small, nondescript office across from Frank Miller. He was exactly as Eleanor had described, a man in his 50s with thinning hair, glasses, and a calm, reassuring demeanor. He listened patiently as I told him the story, starting with the birthday party, ending with the credit card statement. I left out the emotional turmoil. I gave him only the facts. He examined the statement. Catherine Winters, he said, typing the name into his computer. And you're certain your daughter-in-law's name is Victoria Patterson, maiden name Miller. That's what she told us, I replied. All right, Mrs. Patterson, he said, his eyes meeting mine. Here's what I can do. I can run a comprehensive background check on both Victoria Patterson and Catherine Winters. I'll look for property records, marriage licenses, criminal history, credit reports, anything in the public record. It will be completely legal and untraceable. He then named his price. It was a significant sum, enough to make my stomach clench. It was a portion of the safety net Robert had so carefully built for me. It was a risk. I thought of Lily's smile, of James's bright, curious eyes. I thought of my son, trapped in a web he couldn't see. Do it, I said, my voice clear and steady. I wrote him a check from my savings account. As my pen moved across the paper, I felt a strange sense of power. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was an investor. I was investing in the truth. As I left his office, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. For the first time in a week, I felt a glimmer of hope. I had pulled the thread. Now, I just had to wait and see what monster was at the other end of it. While I waited for Frank Miller's report, the silence from the Mediterranean was finally broken. My sister Ruth called. Her voice was unnaturally cheerful, laced with an undercurrent of guilt. Martha, we were just thinking of you. Italy is beautiful. You would love it. I kept my voice even. I'm sure I would. How was the cruise? Oh, it was wonderful. A last-minute thing, you know? Victoria is just so spontaneous. Richard won a big contract, a huge promotion was on the line, and she said they had to celebrate. We were just lucky to be included. A promotion. That was the new lie, a convenient excuse to justify the extravagance and the secrecy. That's nice, Ruth, I said. I'm glad you had a good time. There was a pause. She knew I wasn't buying it. Martha, are you angry? I felt terrible about your birthday, truly, but Victoria insisted it was what you would want, for us to support Richard and not make a fuss. What you would want. Victoria hadn't just lied to me. She had used my own personality, my tendency to avoid conflict, as a weapon to manipulate my own sister. I said, I'm not angry, I lied. I was just surprised. You all have fun. We'll talk when you get back. I hung up the phone, my hand trembling slightly. It wasn't just Victoria I was up against. It was the carefully constructed narrative she had sold to everyone, including my own family. To them, she was the fun, spontaneous daughter-in-law, and I was the quiet, slightly morose mother who was best left undisturbed. The question that haunted me during those days of waiting was, why? Why was my son, a smart, successful man, so completely blind to her manipulations? The answer, I feared, lay in a past that had nothing to do with Victoria. It had to do with his father. Robert, my late husband, was a good man, a wonderful provider, but he was a product of his generation. He was a stern, demanding father. He loved Richard fiercely, but his way of showing it was to push him relentlessly. Good grades weren't good enough. They had to be the best. A spot on the team wasn't enough. He had to be the captain. I remembered countless dinners where Richard's achievements were met not with praise, but with a critical analysis of how he could have done better.
After Robert's funeral, I thought Richard would finally be free of that pressure. But I see now that the fear of not being good enough had been permanently etched into his soul. And then along came Victoria. I found myself drifting back to the early days of their relationship. I remembered one dinner, shortly after they'd moved in together. Richard was talking excitedly about a design competition he'd entered. The prize money would be a huge help with the down payment on a house, he'd said, his eyes shining. Before I could say a word, Victoria reached over and squeezed his hand. "You're going to win, honey. Your work is brilliant. You're the most talented architect in this city. They'd be crazy not to pick you." Her praise was absolute, unconditional. She didn't ask about the other competitors. She didn't analyze his strategy. She just declared his victory. I saw Richard visibly relax, his shoulders losing a tension I hadn't even realized was there. A few weeks later, he didn't win. He came in second. I called to console him, to tell him how proud I was that he'd placed so high. "It's okay, Mom," he said, his voice distant. "Victoria already talked me through it. She said the judges were just biased towards a more traditional style. She thinks my design was far superior." She hadn't just consoled him, she had given him an external enemy, a way to frame his loss as an injustice, preserving his fragile ego. At the time, I thought it was sweet, if a little naive. Now I saw it for what it was, a masterstroke of manipulation. She had identified his deepest wound, his fear of failure, and had positioned herself as the sole guardian of his self-worth. She became his shield. Any criticism, any setback was deflected. A client who didn't like his proposal, they had no taste. A colleague who got a better salary, he was just better at office politics. Me, his mother, expressing a gentle concern that he was working too hard, I just didn't understand the pressure he was under. She didn't just build him up, she built a fortress around him, with herself as the gatekeeper. And the price of admission to his world was absolute agreement with her. My questions, my gentle challenges, were perceived as attacks. So I learned to stop asking them. I learned to keep the peace. And in doing so, I had allowed her to complete her isolation campaign. Richard wasn't blind because he was stupid. He was blind because Victoria had offered him a world without judgment, a world where he was always the hero, always right. It was a powerful, addictive drug, and he had been taking it for nearly a decade. To question her would mean questioning his own success, his own judgment, his entire sense of self. It was a price too high for him to pay. The phone rang, jolting me from my reverie. It was Frank Miller. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, his voice all business, "I have something. I think you should come down to my office." My heart hammered against my ribs. The waiting was over. The truth, whatever it was here. The air in Frank Miller's office was thick with the smell of stale coffee and photocopier toner. He didn't waste any time on pleasantries. He gestured for me to sit and slid a thin manila folder across his desk. "Your instincts were spot on, Mrs. Patterson," he began, his voice grim. "Victoria Ann Patterson, née Miller, does not exist in any official records before her marriage to your son." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the words. "What do you mean?" "He means there is no birth certificate, no social security number, no record of a Victoria Miller. It's as if she appeared out of thin air in her mid-20s. However," he paused, tapping the folder, "Catherine Rose Winters' very real is very real." He opened the folder. The first page was a copy of a marriage license from Nevada, dated 12 years ago. The names on the license were Catherine Rose Winters and James Allen Fletcher. "James Fletcher," Frank said, "is a successful software developer in San Jose. They were married for 2 years. The divorce was finalized 10 years ago. Mr. Fletcher paid a significant settlement." He flipped the page. Another marriage license, this one from Texas, dated 15 years ago. The names were Catherine R. Winters and Robert T. Kim. "Robert Kim," Frank continued, "is an oil and gas executive in Houston. That marriage lasted just under 18 months. He also paid a hefty settlement." My head was spinning. 2 previous marriages, 2 wealthy husbands, and in both cases, she had used the same name, Catherine Winters.
My daughter-in-law wasn't just a liar. She was a serial predator who had honed her craft over more than a decade. And it gets stranger, Frank said, leaning forward. Before these marriages, Catherine Winters was in a long-term relationship with a businessman in Arizona. His name is Michael Chen. They never married, but according to a source I have, they lived together for 3 years. Then, one day, she vanished, cleared out their joint bank account, and disappeared without a trace. I felt nauseous. Why did they break up? Frank looked down at his notes. According to my source, she had just told him she was pregnant. The air left my lungs in a sudden whoosh. Pregnant. The timing would have been just before she met Richard. My grandson, James, could he be? Frank saw the look on my face. There's no way to know that for sure from public records, Mrs. Patterson. That's as far as I can legally go. I sat in stunned silence, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with horrifying speed. The exclusion, the lies, the isolation. It was all part of her pattern. She had to keep me at a distance because I was the one person who might notice things. A grandmother who had raised a son would notice if her grandson bore no resemblance to him. She had to discredit me, paint me as a dotty old woman so that if I ever did voice a suspicion, no one would believe me. "What do I do with this?" I asked, my voice hoarse. My hand rested on the folder, a dossier of deceit that implicated the woman my son loved. "Legally, you have a few options," Frank said, "but in family matters, the law is a blunt instrument. My advice? You need more than just paper. You need a witness. You need one of these men to corroborate the story." The thought was terrifying. Approaching a complete stranger, a man who had been hurt and humiliated, and asking him to dredge up his past, it seemed impossible. "Which one?" I asked. "Who is the most likely to listen?" Frank considered for a moment. "Robert Kim is a public figure, very protective of his reputation. He won't talk. Michael Chen might be too emotional, too angry. My bet is on James Fletcher. He's a private person, a tech guy. He was the most recent. The wound might still be fresh enough for him to want some form of justice." He gave me Fletcher's address and phone number. For 2 days, the information sat on my kitchen counter, radiating a quiet menace. Could I do this? Could I, Martha Patterson, a retired teacher from Ohio, call a stranger in California and blow his life open all over again?
On the 3rd day, I knew I had no choice. Waiting for someone else to act was what had gotten me into this mess. I had to be the one to move the pieces forward. I booked a flight to San Jose for the following morning. I didn't tell Eleanor. I didn't tell anyone. This was a pilgrimage I had to make alone. The next afternoon, I found myself standing in front of a modest, modern house in a quiet Silicon Valley suburb. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I raised my hand to ring the doorbell, my courage failing. What if he slammed the door in my face? What if he called the police? I took a deep breath and pressed the button. A moment later, the door opened. A man in his late 40s with kind eyes and a weary expression looked out at me. He was holding a coffee mug. "Yes?" he asked. "Can I help you?" My carefully rehearsed speech evaporated from my mind. All I could do was speak the truth. "Mr. Fletcher," I began, my voice trembling slightly, "my name is Martha Patterson. I know this is going to sound insane, but I believe my son is currently married to your ex-wife." He stared at me, his face betraying no emotion. The silence stretched for an eternity. I was sure he was about to shut the door. Instead, he sighed, a deep, tired sound. "Catherine," he said, the name a bitter pill on his tongue. He looked past me at the quiet street, then back at me, his eyes filled with a sudden, profound sadness. "You'd better come in." James Fletcher's home was neat and orderly, filled with books and technology. It felt like the home of a man who found comfort in logic and reason, which made the chaos Catherine had inflicted on his life seem all the more cruel. He poured me a glass of water, his hands steady, but his eyes held the haunted look of a man who had seen the abyss. We sat in his living room, and I told him everything. I showed him the photo of Victoria, of Catherine, with my son and my grandchildren. A flicker of recognition, and perhaps pain, crossed his face before he masked it. "She hasn't changed," he said quietly. The same smile, the same look in her eyes, like she owns the world. He then told me his story. It was chillingly familiar. He'd met her at a tech conference. She was charming, intelligent, and deeply impressed by his work. She made him feel like a king. She isolated him from his friends, convincing him they were jealous of his success. She managed all their finances, and by the time he realized how much money was disappearing, it was too late. The divorce had been swift and brutal. "She's a ghost," he said, staring into his empty coffee mug. "She creates this perfect persona, and once she has what she wants, she disappears, leaving nothing but wreckage behind. I hired a lawyer, tried to fight it, but she was always one step ahead. It was my word against hers, and she was a much better liar." "I have more than my word," I said, pushing Frank Miller's folder across the coffee table. He read through the documents, his eyebrows rising higher with each page. He saw the marriage license to Robert Kim. He saw the information about Michael Chen. "My God," he whispered. "I thought I was the only one. She told me she was her first husband. She told my son she'd never been married." A grim understanding passed between us. We were members of a club neither of us had ever wanted to join. "What do you want from me, Mrs. Patterson?" he asked, his voice raw. "I want to save my son," I said simply. "And I need your help. I need you to be a witness, to prove that this isn't just a misunderstanding. It's a pattern, a premeditated crime." He was silent for a long time, weighing the cost of reopening old wounds against the possibility of stopping her. "It won't be enough," he finally said. "My testimony helps, but it's still he said, she said. The person you really need to talk to is Michael Chen. If she was pregnant when she left him and the timeline matches up with your grandson's birth, that's not just fraud. That changes everything. It's the one lie she can't talk her way out of." He looked at the contact information Frank Miller had found for Michael Chen in Arizona. "She broke him," Fletcher said. "He was crazy about her. When she vanished, he spent a fortune trying to find her. After a year, he just gave up. He might not want to hear her name ever again." "Will you call him?" I asked. "He might not take a call from me, but from you, another victim?" James Fletcher, the man who had wanted nothing more than to forget, looked at me, a 70-year-old woman who had flown across the country on a desperate mission. I saw a spark of his old fighting spirit return. He nodded. "I'll call him." 2 days later, back in my own kitchen, I got a call from an Arizona number. It was Michael Chen. His voice was wary, tinged with a deep-seated bitterness. James Fletcher had primed him, but he was still reluctant. "Look, Mrs. Patterson," he said, "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I closed that chapter of my life a long time ago. Catherine, or whatever she calls herself now, is a black hole. She destroys everything she touches. I just want to be left alone." "Mr. Chen," I said, my voice pleading, "this isn't just about money or a broken heart anymore. There's a child involved. A little boy named James. He just turned 7. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "James?" he repeated, his voice cracking. "Yes," I said, "my grandson. He is the kindest, brightest boy you will ever meet, and he might be your son." Silence. For a full minute, all I could hear was his ragged breathing. The wall of his cynicism was crumbling. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "I need you to take a DNA test.
There are ways to do it legally, a paternity test that would be admissible in court. My investigator, Frank, can arrange it. It would require a sample from my grandson. This was the hardest part. It felt like a betrayal of James to subject him to this, but it was a necessary betrayal to save him from a much larger one. Getting a sample won't be easy, I said. Victoria watches him like a hawk. I'll pay for it, he said, his voice suddenly full of conviction. I have to know. The plan was set. Frank arranged for a legal, court-admissible DNA kit to be sent to me. My task was simple, yet fraught with peril. I had to get a DNA sample from James. A toothbrush, a strand of hair, a used Band-Aid, something that wouldn't arouse Victoria's suspicion. The family was due back from the cruise in 2 days. The final piece of the puzzle was within my grasp. All I had to do was hold my nerve, play the part of the forgiving mother, and wait for my moment. The hunter was setting her trap. The phone call from Richard came the day after they landed. His voice was a cocktail of feigned tearfulness and genuine guilt. "Mom, we're back! The trip was incredible, but we missed you."
Liar, I thought, but my voice was warm honey. "Oh, I'm so glad to hear your voice, sweetheart. I can't wait to see the pictures and hear all about it. Why don't you all come for dinner on Sunday? Nothing fancy, just a simple welcome home roast." There it was, the bait, a return to the scene of the crime. "That sounds wonderful, Mom," he said, the relief in his voice palpable. He thought he was being let off the hook. "We'd love that. Victoria has been saying she wants to spend more time with you." The call ended, and I leaned against the kitchen counter, my heart thudding. The trap was set. Now I had to prepare for the arrival of my quarry. Sunday arrived, cloaked in a brilliant autumn sky. This time, I didn't pull out the good silver. I didn't use the starched linens. I used the everyday dishes. The meal was simple. I was no longer trying to impress them. I was studying them. They arrived at 6 on the dot, a portrait of a happy, sun-kissed family. Victoria swept in, giving me an air kiss that smelled of expensive perfume. "Martha, you are a saint for doing this. We are so exhausted." She handed me a cheap, brightly colored scarf. "We brought you this from a little market in Capri." I smiled and thanked her, folding the garish fabric and placing it on a side table. The dinner was a master class in Victoria's manipulative genius. She controlled the entire conversation, a brilliant conductor of her small orchestra. When James started to tell me about a big fish he saw from the ship, she cut in. "James, honey, don't bore Grandma with your fish stories. Tell her about the nice Italian lessons you were taking." When Richard mentioned the demanding new contract at work, the one that had supposedly earned him this surprise trip, she placed a hand on his arm. "Don't you worry about work tonight, my love. Tonight is about family." She would then turn to me. "He works so hard, Martha. My only goal is to make sure he has a life free of stress." Every word was designed to reinforce her role as his protector and mine as a potential source of that stress. I just smiled, nodded, and passed the potatoes. I was no longer a participant. I was an anthropologist, observing the tribal rituals of a family held captive. My opportunity came after dinner. The kids were in the living room, watching a movie. I'd suggested it, a new animated feature I'd accidentally bought. "James, honey," I said, as he ran past me, "you've got a little chocolate on your cheek." He stopped, and I used a napkin to gently wipe his face. As I did, my other hand, the one holding a small, sterile wipe from the DNA kit, deftly brushed against the inside of his cheek as I steadied his head. It was over in 2 seconds. He didn't even notice. "Thanks, Grandma," he said, and ran off. My hands were shaking. I excused myself to the bathroom, my heart racing. I carefully sealed the swab in the provided container, my breath held tight in my chest. It was done. I placed the small package into a pre-addressed, prepaid express envelope. I would drop it in the mail slot first thing in the morning. I returned to the dining room, where Richard and Victoria were finishing their coffee. It was time to begin the real work. It was time to start unraveling the thread right in front of her. I decided to start the attack with a soft probe, a seemingly innocent question. "Victoria," I began, my voice casual, "Eleanor was asking me about your family the other day, and I realized I know so little. You must tell me about your hometown. It must be so different from Ohio. I'd love to take the kids to see where their mother grew up one day." I watched her closely. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of panic crossed her eyes before being replaced by a practiced, wistful smile. "Oh, Martha, it was a tiny little place in upstate New York. So quiet. You'd be bored to tears. Nothing much to see, I'm afraid." She had a story ready. Of course she did. "Really?" I pressed gently, leaning forward with an interested expression. "What was it called? Maybe we could look it up online." "Elm Creek," she said, the name rolling off her tongue with ease. "But I doubt you'll find it. It's barely a spot on the map." I smiled. A genuine, cold smile she couldn't possibly understand. "That's so funny," I said, taking a slow sip of my tea, "because I had a little time on my hands this week, and I was doing some family research. And the oddest thing is, I found records of your family, the Winters, but they weren't from a little town called Elm Creek at all. They were from Houston." The teacup in Victoria's hand rattled against its saucer. Her face, for the first time I'd known her, went completely blank with shock. Richard looked from her to me, a confused frown on his face. "Winters? Mom, what are you talking about? Victoria's name is Miller." "Is it, dear?" I asked, my eyes locked on the woman who was now dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. "Why don't you tell him, Catherine?" The game had begun. The first card had been played, and by the look of pure, unadulterated terror on her face, I knew she had just realized she was playing against an opponent she had fatally underestimated. The name hung in the air, electric and dangerous. Catherine. Victoria, or Catherine, recovered in a heartbeat. The shock on her face was replaced by a look of deep, profound hurt. Her eyes welled with tears. She was a performer, and this was her opening night. "Mom, what are you doing?" Richard said, his voice sharp with confusion and a rising anger directed at me. "Why are you calling her that? Why are you upsetting her?" "Because it's her name, Richard," I said calmly, not taking my eyes off the woman who was now dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. "Martha, please," Catherine whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know what you're talking about. My mother's maiden name was Winters. Maybe that's what you found. It's a painful subject." "It's more than a painful subject, dear," I said, my voice still quiet. I reached into the sideboard drawer behind me and pulled out a simple envelope. I slid it across the table towards Richard. He hesitated, looking at his crying wife, then at my resolute face. He opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The top read, in bold letters, "Paternity test." He scanned the document, his brow furrowed in confusion. He saw his name, James Patterson's name, and a name he didn't recognize, Michael Chin. His eyes darted to the bottom line, the one that gave the conclusion in cold, scientific language. Probability of paternity, 0%. "What is this?" he asked, his voice a choked whisper. "Mom, this is insane. It's some kind of mistake." This was Catherine's cue. She shot up from her chair, her face a mask of righteous fury. "A mistake? Richard, your mother is accusing me of cheating. After everything we've been through? How could you even look at that? How could you let her do this to us?" She turned on me, her voice rising.
This is because of the cruise, isn't it? This is your twisted way of getting revenge. You are a cruel, jealous old woman.
She was good. She was magnificent. She was turning my evidence into an attack on her character, a petty retaliation for a family holiday. She was trying to make Richard choose between a bizarre, unbelievable piece of paper and his loyal, loving wife. "It's not revenge, Victoria," I said, using her chosen name to show I was still playing her game. I was letting her think she still had control. "It's a mother's concern. Perhaps there's an explanation. After all, you told me yourself how much you wanted to give my son a family. Maybe you had to seek help from a clinic? A donor?" I offered her a lifeline, a plausible lie. It was the final part of my trap. I needed her to commit to a new falsehood, right here, right now. A look of relief washed over her face. She saw the out I had given her. She seized it. She collapsed back into her chair, sobbing. "Yes," she cried, burying her face in her hands. "Yes, that's it. Richard, darling, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to tell you. We were trying for so long and nothing was happening. The doctor said the problem was with you. Your count was low. I couldn't bear to tell you. I couldn't bear to hurt your pride. So I went to a clinic. I used a donor. James is still our son, my love, my blood, my body. I did it for us." It was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. She confessed to a lie, but framed it as an act of selfless love, designed to protect her husband's fragile ego. She made herself a martyr. Richard stared at her, his face a canvas of shock, hurt, and dawning adoration for her sacrifice. He was buying it. He was actually buying it. He reached a hand out to her. "Tori, why didn't you tell me? We could have faced it together." "I was too ashamed," she wept. I let the scene play out. I let her think she had won. I let her believe she had successfully navigated the crisis. Then, when the tears were subsiding, I spoke again, my voice cutting through the thick, emotional air. "That is a truly heartbreaking story, dear. You are so strong. It must have been so difficult to carry that burden alone." I paused, letting my sympathy hang in the air before I sliced it down. "But it makes me wonder, was that why you didn't tell Richard about your first husband either, James Fletcher? Were you trying to protect him from that too?" The silence that followed was absolute. Catherine's head snapped up, her eyes wide with genuine, unadulterated panic. The color drained from her face. This was a name she had not expected to hear. This was not in her script. "What?" Richard breathed, his hand frozen halfway to his wife. As if on cue, the doorbell rang. I stood up. "Excuse me," I said, my voice calm. I walked to the front door and opened it. Standing on my porch was James Fletcher. He looked nervous, but resolute. I nodded at him, and he stepped inside. I led him into the dining room. Catherine looked as if she had seen a ghost. She was staring at a man she had destroyed and left behind a decade ago. "Hello, Catherine," Fletcher said, his voice steady. Richard looked back and forth between the stranger and his wife, his mind refusing to connect the dots. "Who are you? What is going on?" "This is James Fletcher," I said simply. "He and Catherine were married in 2012. He was her second husband." "Second?" Richard croaked. "Yes," I said. "The first was a man named Robert Kim. But I think the man you really need to meet is the donor. He was so very keen to be here tonight." I walked back to the still open front door and gestured to a car parked at the curb. Michael Chen stepped out, he walked up the path and into my house, his eyes fixed on one person, Catherine. "Hello, Cat," he said, his voice shaking with years of repressed anger and grief. "It's been a long time. We have a son to talk about." Catherine stared at the three men who represented her secret past. Fletcher, the husband she fleeced, Michael, the man she abandoned and the father of her child, and Richard, her current Mark. Her fortress of lies, so carefully constructed over years, had just been leveled by a 70-year-old English teacher.
The house of cards had come tumbling down. For a moment, nobody moved. The scene was frozen, a tableau of disbelief and exposure. Richard stood between the ghosts of his wife's past and the woman herself, his face pale and slack with shock. Catherine, for the first time, had no words. Her brilliant, manipulative mind had finally short-circuited. There was no lie big enough to cover this. Then her survival instincts kicked in. She made a dash for the living room, her voice a shrill cry, "James! Lily, come on, we're leaving!" Michael Chen, his face a thundercloud, moved to block her path. "You're not taking my son anywhere." "She's not your son," she shrieked, her composure completely gone. "This is a trick. They're all lying. Richard, darling, you have to believe me." But Richard wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at James Fletcher's weary, sad face. He was looking at the raw paternal anger in Michael Chen's eyes. He was looking at the mountain of evidence that had just been piled on his dining room table. He finally turned his gaze to me, and in his eyes, I saw the dawning horror of a man realizing his entire life has been a fabrication. "The cruise," he said, his voice hoarse, the connection finally made. "It wasn't for my promotion, was it? It was for Mom's birthday. You did it on purpose." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. That small, specific cruelty seemed to be the one thing that cut through all the other larger deceptions. The grand betrayal was abstract, but leaving his mother alone on her 70th birthday was a simple, brutal act he could understand. I stammered, "I wanted to give you a perfect family vacation, away from all the stress." "Away from her?" Richard gestured toward me. "You wanted me away from my own mother." Desperate, Catherine played her final, ugliest card. She turned on Richard, her eyes flashing with malice. "You think you're so perfect? You want to talk about lies? Let's talk about that building inspection you covered up last year. Let's talk about the consulting fees you paid to get that city contract. You think your firm wants to hear about that? I can ruin you, Richard. You don't dare turn on me." It was a fatal miscalculation. In trying to threaten him, she had revealed her true nature. She wasn't his protector. She was his warden. The love she had professed was nothing more than leverage. Richard looked at her, truly looked at her, and I saw the last vestiges of his love and trust die in his eyes. He straightened up, and for the first time in years, he looked like my son again, strong and clear-eyed. "Get out of my house," he said, his voice low and dangerously quiet. "Get out, Catherine, and don't you ever speak to me or my children again." She stared at him, aghast that her final threat had failed. She looked at me, at Fletcher, at Chen. She was surrounded, defeated. With a final venomous glare, she grabbed her purse and stormed out the front door, slamming it so hard the windows rattled.
And then there was silence. The aftermath was messy and painful. The next few days were a blur of lawyers and difficult conversations. Richard, with my full support, filed for an emergency custody order and began divorce proceedings. Catherine, faced with irrefutable evidence of fraud and multiple bigamous marriages, didn't fight for custody. Her lawyer's only goal was to negotiate a settlement that would keep her from facing criminal charges. She disappeared from our lives as quickly as she had entered them, a wraith returning to the shadows. But the real work was just beginning. The legal battle was simple compared to the emotional one. How do you explain to a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old that their mother is gone? How do you explain to a boy that the man he calls dad is not his biological father? We sought help. Dr. Jenkins, a kind and patient family therapist, guided us through the minefield. I sat with Richard in her office, watching my son, a successful and confident man, crumble as he confronted his own gullibility and the depth of his wife's deceit. "How could I have been so stupid, Mom?" he asked me one night, his head in his hands. "For years. How could I not see it?"
"Well, she found your biggest fear, sweetheart," I told him, my hand on his shoulder. "The fear of not being good enough. And she made it go away." That's a powerful drug. It wasn't stupidity, Richard. It was hope. You hoped you'd found a perfect love. The conversation with James was the hardest. Richard and I sat with him, Dr. Jenkins guiding the words. We told him that he was loved beyond measure by so many people. And we told him that he had a special gift. He had a father who was raising him, and he also had a first father who had been looking for him for a very long time and wanted to meet him. There were tears and confusion. Lily became clingy, afraid that more people she loved would disappear. My home, which had once been the scene of my loneliest moment, became a sanctuary, a hospital for my broken family. I cooked their favorite meals. I read them bedtime stories. I listened. I simply existed as a steady, unwavering presence, the anchor they all needed in the storm. The shards of our family were scattered all over the floor. And together, piece by painful piece, we began to put them back together. 1 year. It took 1 year to find our footing again. A year of therapy sessions, of awkward first meetings, and of slowly, carefully building a new kind of family. Michael Chen was a godsend. After the truth came out, he didn't storm in and demand his rights. He moved into a nearby apartment and showed a patience and grace that was extraordinary. He let Richard continue to be dad. He took on the role of Michael, a special, ever-present uncle who took James to baseball games and helped him with his science projects. He understood that fatherhood was more than just DNA. It was about showing up day after day. The first time James called Richard Dad and Michael Pop, we all held our breath. It came out so naturally, and James just beamed, proud of his unique situation. He told his teacher he had the most daddies in his class. In the simple, accepting logic of a child, he had solved a problem the adults had agonized over. My relationship with Richard was reborn. The walls Victoria had built between us were gone, and in their place was a raw, honest communication that we hadn't shared since he was a teenager. He talked about his insecurities, his fears, and I talked about my loneliness and my regrets for having stayed silent for so long. We rebuilt our bond on a foundation of truth, not just tradition. Even my sister Ruth came back into the fold. She had shown up at my door a week after the fateful dinner, her face streaked with tears, full of apologies. She had been charmed and manipulated just as Richard had been, and her guilt was immense. I forgave her, of course. Forgiveness, I was learning, was not about condoning the act, but about releasing myself from the burden of carrying the anger. Today, on my 71st birthday, there is no grand catered affair. There is a collection of mismatched blankets on the grass in the local park. The air is warm, and the scent of freshly cut grass hangs in the air. Richard is teaching Lily how to fly a kite, his laughter carrying on the breeze. Michael and James are in a heated negotiation over the rules of a card game. Eleanor is here, sitting next to me on the blanket, her presence as comfortable and necessary as the sun on my skin. Ruth and Carl are unpacking a picnic basket overflowing with food. Richard jogs over to me, a wide, genuine smile on his face. He no longer looks haunted. He looks free. He's even started dating again. Cautiously, a woman his own age, with kind eyes and no hidden agenda. "Happy birthday, Mom," he says to me, handing me a small, clumsily wrapped gift. It's from Lily. Inside is a framed drawing of our family. It's a chaotic swirl of color. There are 2 big stick figures for Richard and Michael, a small one for Lily, and a slightly bigger one for James. And right in the center, holding everyone's hand, is a figure with a big smile and a wild crown of white hair. Me. I look at this new family portrait, unconventional, messy, and absolutely beautiful. The pain of last year's birthday seems like a distant dream. That empty house, those silent chairs, they weren't an ending. They were a violent, necessary clearing of the brush. They forced me to find the strength I didn't know I had, to fight for the people I loved. The silence of that empty house had forced me to finally find my own voice. The betrayal had taught me the value of boundaries. I had lost a daughter-in-law built of lies, but I had gained a family forged in truth. And most importantly, I had reclaimed my rightful place at the center of it all, not as a silent servant, but as the loved and respected matriarch. I lean back on the blanket, close my eyes, and listen to the sound of my family's laughter. It is the sweetest music I have ever heard.